Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
And your co-host, Rich Gear, here as well. And Jeff, back at us for part two. Hopefully it won't be only part two. And we got some neat things to talk about tonight, right? What are we titling the show tonight?
Well, we're going to talk about the attraction of theistic evolution.
Okay.
And why it's, it's such a popular thing to compromise with evolution, because you can have your foot over here in one camp and your other foot over here in heaven, and you can get along with happily with all these different sides.
You can have your cake and eat it too. Well, Doug, before we go, do you want to define theistic evolution for our audience, just so make sure that everybody's on the same page with us? I would kind of, so they know what we're talking about when we go when Jeff starts going into our stuff,
Yeah, that's actually a little bit hard to define because there's a whole lot of different flavors.
There's flavors, but the basic gist of it is pretty straightforward,
Yeah, what you have is you're saying that probably the first part of Genesis is either a myth or it's something that is an allegory of what
symbolic.
actually happened.
Yeah.
And probably what happened was that during that period of time of over millions of years, God decided, well, I'm going to pick out these two ape-like creatures, and they're going to be Adam and Eve, and they're going to then you start into the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man and that sort of thing, and you have a lot of evangelical Christians, coming into this camp. It's a popular thing now. There's a lot of prominent scientists that are proposing this side of thing, like Francis Collins.
He's the one I remember reading that book about him years ago.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that these guys, a lot of the things that these guys write are pretty good, but the theology is kind of messed up, and in terms of Christianity, it's sort of a mixture of a lot of different things. Like there's some pantheism thrown in there, some deism. And it's sort of like, way back in time, some far off distance, God wound things up and started things going off, but then evolution started its mechanism of producing all the plants and animals and birds and everything else, and then enters the story of Adam and Eve, and that was usually they'll say Adam and Eve really didn't exist. They were just figures in the imaginations of the minds of the people who wrote the Bible.
In reality, the class thing would be like, okay, we believe in Jesus, but evolution is true. Okay, right. So God maybe started it all. It's almost, there's some deistic kind of tendencies in it in some respects, the way I read it. But basically, evolution is true. The Bible is true as far as it doesn't contradict evolution. That's usually what I've seen. Okay, and they're taking that as their premise rather than the biblical text. As creationists, we take great issue with that idea, but we understand that many people have not read through or thought it through fully. They just think, okay, this story is like this, and they've been either ridiculed or they haven't read it themselves, and the culture at large is really feels quite compatible if they have the two beliefs that we believe are mutually exclusive. Absolutely.
Well, and like you mentioned, there are a lot of Christians, a lot of scholars, a lot of theologians who are now working on this issue, and they're coming at it from an evolutionary worldview, really.
Because that's what they were trained in their scientific training.
Well, some of them are theologians who, on everything else, like you said, they're very good. They believe in the deity of Christ. They believe in the resurrection. They believe in salvation by faith alone and Christ alone. But then they come to this issue and they look at Genesis, and they have, like, for example, N.T. Wright, who is a big popular, he's written great work on the resurrection, etc. But now he's sort of paired up a little bit with BioLogos, the Francis Collins organization, and he has said things like, well, maybe Adam and Eve were two hominid creatures who were chosen out of this group because the science says there couldn't have been, just two humans. It had to be a group of hominids, and maybe God just chose these two as representatives. And that sounds good to us. We say, oh yeah, there's representation in the Bible, right? We have Adam representing us, but once you start to think about that issue of representation, and I've thought about this because I came across a post on Facebook that had to do with our church, our denomination, and they were, they were leaning towards this view of theistic evolution and how do we reconcile Adam and Eve and all this kind of thing, and talked about the representation. I started thinking about it. I said, well, that's kind of backwards because Adam represents humankind as his descendants, not as his the people before him, not his ancestors. He doesn't represent his ancestors, and that's what theistic evolution says. It says, well, God chose these two to represent the ancestors, the hominids, the 20,000 or whatever it was, right? And so it's backwards. But you won't think about that. You just say, yeah, we have representation, and
all of those, don't they, it just begs the question, because, and we don't want to get too far afield on this, but the reality is, how you originally started with two ape-like hominids. Well, how did you get a male and a female? We talked about
these
that.
are the scientific problems.
Right. And I'm saying, and no matter what you do, you're going to get back to a certain point where life comes from non-life, which is to disprove spontaneous generation.
Right.
And by the time you get to the hominids, you've already broken every scientific law 100 times over. There's been no evidence of any of it. But the reality is, I have an issue with starting from, quote, the human viewpoint first, rather than the biblical text, which is very clear and plain. But also, if the implications we get out of it have really a lot of it. Now, you had some points here. You said there was something, an article or something that they were
before we get into that.
you want to go somewhere before that?
We're talking about the attraction of.
Yeah, that's what I was getting to.
Of this view.
Why is it attractive?
I think, Doug, you were going to talk about your experience.
Yeah, I was going to talk about my experience.
Yeah, let's do that, Doug.
Because, when I was growing up, I grew up in the church, and I was, I didn't have that bad of an experience with the church. So, but I was also very much interested in science, and it got to the point in junior high school, and into college, where science was sort of my main attraction of what I really wanted to do. Science was was what I was interested in. What I really found fascinating was trying to figure out how chemistry works, how biology works, and in geology, all these different things. And I found that the science was sort of like a pride thing. Why was I into science? Basically it was a mechanism to have other people admire me, if you know what I mean. It was a pride thing when I was into it, and I still love science, and science is, as a method has its valid mechanisms to find out whether something is true or false, because you're investigating things that you find in the present to figure out different things of what happens. And I remember that there was a period when I was realizing that when I was going into college, they weren't really doing what I was called pure science. Basically, they were regurgitating out of the textbook what other people had found out. And so you didn't really have the thrill or the experience of actually investigating something for something new. You were really just going in and repeating what the
scientists... Well, you're just paying dues at that level, aren't you?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. Right. But that sort of took away the fervor I had for science, because I liked the investigation, and the research part of it, And when I ended up realizing that, all I was doing was following these cookbook experiments in my classes, and I'm learning the basics, but I wanted some more of this real life investigation and research, and that was what motivated me in science. And I actually took a class at Lansing Community College while I was in high school, where they actually let you do and investigate your own experiment and report the results. Mine was trying to make amino acids combine together to form proteins.
Is that your brown sticky goo experiment?
That was my brown sticky goo experiment.
Yeah.
And when I was realizing, I was taken off the Miller-Urey experiment, and at that time I would call myself a theistic evolutionist, because I figured that somehow life had come about over this period of millions of years, and so I was going to investigate that. And it was that experiment that actually brought me up to a dead stop in my thinking, because I realized that the chemical reactions that I was trying to produce just wasn't going to happen.
Just didn't do what you thought it was going to do or supposed to do.
And that's the trouble, is that right now you have a lot of people thinking, well, all we need is to find these meteorites that have landed in Antarctica with all these chemical compounds on it that are, and somehow during that transit that all became left-handed amino acids, because it burned off all the right-handed amino acids, and so this meteorite with this pure amino acids all of a sudden became the precursor of life on the Earth.
Is this the panspermia idea?
Yeah, the panspermia, yeah, that's part of it. And so, and that my investigation was even before those theories came about. This was about 1967 or 68. And so I was still a youngster. Yeah, but I was starting to realize, this chemistry doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so I started looking into it, and 50 years later, it still doesn't work. So it was that where I began to try to find other people who were saying the same thing I was investigating, and I found this guy on MSU campus. His name is Dr. John Moore.
John Moore, yeah.
And he was the lone creationist professor at MSU, and he was working with the Creation Research Society, and so I got in, picked his brain, and that's where I dispelled this idea of theistic evolution, as well as the gap theory, which I was really into quite a bit, because before I met him, there was another preacher who was talking the gap theory, but he made some excellent arguments, the same as what I had found. And I remember him saying, "Well, how did the nose of the dolphin go to the back of his head?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Wow, that doesn't work, does it?" And then nothing works until everything works, and those arguments was sort of stuck with me.
That even predates Behe and all those guys, yeah.
Right. Well, and you were saying before that, or before we started the show, that the theistic evolution idea, and this is what I've experienced, is back, and I had the same experience as you, only I wasn't a scientist. I wasn't going to school and doing experiments and being led that way. But I used to pick up the Bible, read, and look at it from a surface level and say, hey, it looks like God makes the earth bring forth creatures. Mm-hmm. Well, that's evolution, right? Oh, look, the fish. The fish are before the land animals.
Oh, yeah.
There you go, that's evolution, right?
Yeah.
So I look at all this and I say, without thinking very deeply at all, just skim across the surface, of what the biblical text says, but go very deep into the science. See,
Right.
Learn that for every day at science class.
Science is the 67th book of the Bible.
Right.
You need to take science,
or creation,
and that,
if you will.
yeah, and so if you want to interpret the real stuff, you take the science over here and add it to the end of the Bible as the 67th book.
And there's an argument to be made from that perspective that's valid in terms of phenomenological, hard, easy for me to say,
right? Yeah.
Language, like the sun rises. Now we know the sun stays where it is, and we rotate around it, right? Or revolve around the sun. So that, in that way, we can be informed by the creation to how to interpret the Bible, except that's observable. That's not a speculation about the distant past. What that is in real
There's also
time.
understanding, because it's the perspective, because a lot of people will use that and say, see the Bible as flawed,
Right.
And I'm going, well, no, when you look at the sun, it looks like it's setting in right.
Right.
So from our perspective, and that's what the
Right.
Bible is written in that perspective very, very often. In fact, most of the time it is. That's why only 6 days have passed, and we won't get into all that stuff. But yet cosmos is stretching out. There's things like that. How things could appear to be, time and space are very interesting phenomenon.
Right.
Talk about that. But you're right about the observation. You can look at something, you say there's movement of some sort. The sun looks like it goes over the horizon. We realize now it's the Earth is rotating.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as you said. And I think, Doug, you kind of touched on it with your realities. You were doing empirical science, was experimenting things in the present, where what they're doing is doing things in the past.
Yeah,
which is
they're doing a
not
forensic
empirical
investigation.
science. It is historical science. It's not invalid totally, but it's basically best evidence is the people that were there. The people that, and granted, you could have people that could miss the testimony, but at least if they were there in a court of law, you're going to say the guy that was there has a better chance than somebody over here just trying to say, well, I'm trying to put things together based on different points, but I haven't really got an eyewitness account.
I got a good example
that's a
of
different
that.
thing,
A good example of that is if you go over to where the Lansing Mall is, and you look at Los Tres Amigos, there's a restaurant over there, and you take all your scientific instrumentation and figure out what that might have looked like 150 years ago. All right, and you sort of take all the evidence that you find here in the present and then go back into the past and then reconstruct what it might have looked like 150 years ago. Well, I can do that because I have a photograph of that area, of the log cabin that sat there 150 years ago. And, it's not that quite long ago, 1870.
Yeah, so.
But it was
140 years ago.
Yeah, it was 140 years ago, and so with my great-great-grandmother and her two sons standing out in front with a couple of horses. And so you can now, there's a little red schoolhouse antique store back there. They've got my photograph of that in their store.
Oh, yeah?
And so now if you want to go over there and investigate it, you go to that store and you can see the photograph.
Yeah, and you might, without that information, you might realize, okay, we think this was used for farmland. The Los Tres Amigos wouldn't have been there. I mean, there are fair extrapolations to a point, but you're really limited in why reject the photograph.
And the further back you go, the harder
it is. Exactly right.
And so you're talking billions
You look
of
at
years.
that with genealogy stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not a big genealogist because going from the present to the past, you might get to the 1600s. Doug loves it, and I have no problem with it. I just never got interested in it because I go, the Bible says we're descended from Adam and Eve. Okay? So when I know we're all related to one another at one point, but there's all these missing links missing gaps. I'll never be able to get back. So to me, it's not that interesting. I go, it's like going to playing a video game that I know I'm eventually going to lose. That's to me what it is. I never can get back there, and so that doesn't float my boat like it does a lot of people. I love the genealogy from Adam to Christ. I love that,
Right.
but we have an eyewitness account says this is how it was made.
Right.
Okay, but the attraction you talked about, and we'll get back, we kind of go a little bit, because there is an attraction about, I mean, let's face it, we as human beings like to be liked. And if you stand up for a creation biblical worldview, you're going to be mocked, especially in schools, high schools and colleges.
Yeah,
when
and that's,
the other worldview is the other way it
that's
is.
one of the things I thought about and jotted down on while I was thinking about this issue. It does, if you are a theistic evolutionist, you can, like you said, have one
You're trying to break
foot
both
here
worlds.
and 1 foot here and sort of straddle the fence. We would say we're straddling the fence. They say, no, we're completely biblical. They would say, oh yeah, we can reconcile this. They're really having a hard time, but they say they're sooner or later. It's kind of like evolution. Hey, we don't know how this happened yet, but in the future we'll figure it out. They approach the Bible the same way.
Well,
They
again, but
say
it's the tail wagging the dog. They're starting with
right.
the science, but I'm going, two things.
but they have a lot of faith. See,
I know,
that's
but
my
two things
point.
always come to me, and I talked about, there was a guy one time, and they were really in the theistic evolution camp.
Okay.
But they really love Jesus. I said, well, then why you just destroyed the work of Jesus, who came to undo the effects of a curse that was brought around by the first two people. Before them, according to biblical record, there was no death and dying and suffering and disease. Okay, and that particular event affected time, space, history in all of realms: physical, spiritual, and emotional. And plants, animals, and humans all were affected.
Right.
But if you say that there was death and dying before Adam and Eve, or whatever you call them, whether they were like hominids and God picked, or you've got death and dying and suffering for millions of years, because we know the T-Rexes, or at least the Allosaur, we've had evidence of disease, tooth decay, bone disease, all kinds of stuff, bite marks like carnivory, and all that is not there. The second part of it is you're telling me Jesus was wrong, because at the beginning, he made them male and female.
And that's
and
where
so the people you claim to worship. See, this is one thing I always have a problem with Christians who try to hybridize that thing. I understand if you say, well, we'll just reject it all, we'll be an atheist. You're more consistent, at least.
Right.
It's still irrational, but it's not. But when you try to combine two things, it really have a really muddy.
Well, that's where
bad mixture,
that's what I was getting at, is the theologians are working on this issue, and they have a lot of faith
But it's
that
all about
sooner or later
respect.
they're going to figure it out, how it could be
pride.
that evolution is true and there weren't really two first humans, but we still can have an Adam and Eve. They have to figure out a way
You still
to make
destroy
it
the
fit.
whole concept of the fall.
Oh,
The
right.
whole
I'm not
Jesus
arguing for
raised.
it. I'm
I
just
know
saying
you're
that's
not.
their-
I'm just saying I
that's the
understand the
view, so.
attraction, because I was theistic evolution before I really actually came to the Lord. I was raised in Roman Catholicism, and I was trying to, and they had this evolution, and they went and talked to the Catholic priests when I was in,
Yeah.
and I believed in all the dinosaur remains. I knew every era, epoch, and eon of the geologic column when I was in first grade. I was fascinated with it. I'm not a scientist. It was an art thing. The dinosaurs got me hooked. That's the propaganda lizard for evolution, is the dinosaur, okay? It just is, and it got me, and I believe in that through college, and I made this hybrid. I thought I was a really original thinker. But it was for me, but I did the same thing. I put the idea about God started it, but the reality is, but evolution, and he created the process called evolution.
And what was the attraction for you then? I mean, it was...
I could hold on to at least a modicum of faith or a spiritual, because something, see, that's the other part of the
your
coin.
faith, and you could have
And the reason why
science.
that's the other part of the attraction is why they don't just go into atheism, not because of popularity, but because inside of us there is a hunger for something supernatural and spiritual. And we recognize that it's true. We know that it's true. Inside of us, everyone knows it's true. They may bury their head in the sand and willfully reject it. But the point is, there's a knowledge in that. Paul says, with the mind I want to serve God, and yet with my actions I do otherwise. We have this built-in knowledge, but we reject it. Okay? But then there's that attraction of that supernatural, of the God thing. But the world is so powerful of a force, it's got you pulling, you got your rickshaw back and
that's
forth.
one of the things
you know?
when the world comes and they say, oh, you believe the earth is only 6,000 years old, or you don't believe in evolution. For example, I just jotted down a couple of quotes. This guy was at the Creation Museum,
Right.
answer to Genesis, and he's a professor at Berkeley.
Okay.
And he says, it's sort of a monument to scientific illiteracy, isn't it? And just ridicule. Richard Dawkins says if you meet somebody who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. So that's the thing.
So ad hominem is supposed to work, but it's effective, I'll tell you that.
Oh, right. He says
Calling
ridicule.
names,
I mean, that's
yeah.
one of the tactics of the new atheists is ridicule faith because it deserves it. You know, so you avoid that.
You know why? Because they've lost all the debates.
You know, you may avoid some of that if you say I believe in the mainstream science, but I'm a Christian. You know, and then they'll look at you and say, "Oh, we see you're a Christian. You know, we may mock you for believing in God, but at least we're not going to mock you for your scientific views. You know, you're on our team."
You know what? They still do. In your face, they might say that, but behind your back, they're mocking you.
Now, there is a scripture that I ran into that sort of jolted me out of the theistic evolution camp, and that is in the Ten Commandments of all places. Okay. So, well, if you're going to be a Christian, you definitely believe in the Ten Commandments, right? Okay, so in Exodus chapter 20, verse 9, it says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all the work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it shalt thou shalt not do any work, nor the son or daughter, or the manservant, the maidservant, nor the cattle, or a stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and the earth, the sea, and all in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And so what it's comparing there is the 7 days of the week with the 7 days of creation.
Interesting that there is no solar or physical, you know how we have a month, it's the moon, goes around a year, we go around the sun.
There's no astronomical reason for a 7 day week.
Exactly, except there's only one, and that's in the Bible.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And God uses that as a one-to-one comparison to what he did in creation.
And they've tried 10-day weeks, and
the French Revolution did it, the communists, and it fails every time.
Yeah,
it fails every time.
What that tells me is that people who want to mix evolution, even though it can reduce your level of ridicule that you must have, it can give you a little bit more credibility with the world. Maybe others have argued that it stops people from thinking they have to choose between science and faith, you know, so they don't want
That's what I want to get there. That is a false dichotomy to me.
Right, well, they claim that that by saying you can't be an evolutionist and also be a Christian, you're setting people up with a choice.
Right, we would say actually, it's not technically. You could be a Christian and be an evolutionist. Yeah. But I think, like you say, you're not thinking it through seriously. But that's
be consistent. Point. We would say yes, you should. But what I found is the deeper you go into Scripture, and the deeper you study it, you find out that just like the Ten Commandments, what are you going to do with that one-to-one comparison between the 6 days of creation and the 6 days we work? You can't break that continuity without doing violence to the text. And if you want to be faithful to the Word of God, you'll reconsider the scientific, quote, consensus and say, you know what? God is true regardless. Maybe these guys over here don't really have all the cards.
Yeah, I don't find
and they weren't there.
I don't find the theistic evolution paradigm to be very satisfying. So with that, we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.